Hello, RMBL. I am Dr. Josh Grinath, a visiting assistant professor at Idaho State University, and I am here with you today to participate in the Summer 2020 seminar series and to share with you some of my stories from conducting research out of RMBL. Let me pull up my presentation for you. Today, I'd like to talk about trophic cascades and to talk about these ecological dynamics in the context of antagonistic, mutualistic ecological webs. And this is a story from Colorado Steppe country, just south of RMBL, in an area just around the Almont Triangle, within the Almont Triangle. Okay. So within this ecological web that I will be talking about, we'll have a variety of different insects and a particular plant that I will focus on. Some of that is shown here. But before we get into the details of my studies, I'd like to just think about species interactions before we get into that. So species interactions are defined by the net outcome of one species' effect on another. And when we think about species interactions, these are bidirectional. We have species 1 over here affecting species 2, but species 2 also has an effect on species 1. So we need to think about it from both of those directions. And when we think about the different types of species interactions that we generally describe as direct species interactions, we can define them as occurring in two broad classes of types of interactions, including antagonistic interactions, in which species have a negative effect on another. This includes predation, parasitism, herbivory, and those types of interactions are defined as one species benefiting the consumer, and then one species being negatively affected, the organism that's being eaten. Then there's also competition between two species, which it has a negative effect on both of those species as they compete for resources. And then there's also amensalism, where one species has a negative effect on the other, but then the other species has no effect on the first. So those are all antagonistic or negative types of species interactions. Counter to that, we can think of mutualistic interactions have only positive or neutral components. And within these mutualistic interactions, we have mutualism, where one species benefits the other and the second species benefits the first. So both species are benefiting from that type of interaction. But then there's also commensalism, where one species benefits another, but then the second species has no effect on the first. So we can think about species interactions as broadly being grouped into those two broad types of interactions: antagonistic and mutualistic. And these are ways that we describe relationships between two species. However, ecological communities are composed of many species. So what happens when we scale out? Ecological webs describe species interactions across an entire ecological community. For instance, food webs are composed of predator-prey types of interactions. And here, for instance, we can see that we have a food web where this plant is being eaten by an aphid, which is being eaten by this lady beetle, which then gets eaten by this bird, and then that bird gets eaten by another. And so these are food webs are generally antagonistic types of ecological webs. But then there are also mutualistic webs. For instance, many ecologists consider mutualistic webs between pollinators and plants. Here we have different pollinators, different bees, signified by the different colors here of their wings and eyes. And then we have different flowers also signified by their different colors. And we can think about the interaction networks or the ecological webs here that occur between these plants and their pollinators. And within ecological webs, we can consider not only the direct interactions between species, but the indirect effects that one species may have on others. For instance, birds, by eating grasshoppers, can indirectly benefit plants. So these plants are benefiting from having fewer herbivores on them. And this is a common type of indirect effect in ecology that's found in ecosystems around the world. And it's generally called a trophic cascade. But what is a trophic cascade? Well, Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin in 1960 wrote a seminal paper in which they first described this dynamic. And what came out of this paper is what is commonly known as the world is green hypothesis. They thought, well, there are lots of plants, but relatively few herbivores compared to how many plants there are in the world. Therefore, we can think of plants as being controlled by competition, and herbivores are regulated by predation. So predators here are having an indirect impact on plants. They indirectly benefit plants via a cascade. So we can see in this diagram to the right here that predators, by having a large effect on herbivores, which is signified by this large blue arrow here, then decrease herbivore abundances or change their behavior in ways that herbivores can then not have a large effect on plants, but they have a relatively weak effect on plants, which is signified by this smaller blue arrow. So these trophic cascades have been shown to occur in ecosystems worldwide. For instance, we can think of a cascade between jaguars, cougars, and plants. And for instance, Terborg et al. Found that jaguars and cougars, by feeding on small rodents called agoutis, which are herbivores and seed consumers, that they could indirectly benefit plants. So when those predators were absent, those herbivores had free reign of the forest. They didn't have to worry about getting eaten at all, and they ate all the plants in the understory, all the young plants that were trying to recruit into that forest. But then when those predators were present, they successfully reduced the abundances of these herbivores, and therefore the plants were able to flourish. And as these types of dynamics have been shown across the world, we have realized how important they really are. They're important for structuring communities, the relative abundances of different species across ecological communities. They occur across different systems and scales from small to large. They affect ecosystem functioning and the services that humans derive from our ecosystems that here on Earth. And this includes nutrient dynamics, fire, and disease control, water quality. And trophic cascades are the basis for many ecological models. However, we're largely missing the consideration of mutualisms in our understanding of trophic cascades. And as this is partially due because as ecologists have considered ecological webs, they have considered antagonistic and mutualistic interactions separately, in separate webs. However, mutualisms are ubiquitous. They occur in ecosystems around the world, just like antagonistic species interactions. And when we really think about ecological webs more holistically, we realize that real webs are composed of both types of interactions, both antagonistic and mutualistic interactions. So really, we need to integrate these two different types of webs because it's an artificial separation that, that has been happening so far. And we can unify these different types of interactions by considering both types of interactions from a consumer resource perspective. So consumer resource interactions make sense for predator-prey types of interactions or herbivory parasitism. Do they make sense for mutualism as well? Well, mutualisms have generally been regarded as non-trophic interactions. However, mutualisms can be considered consumer resource interactions. For instance, let's consider two-way consumer resource mutualisms. Have you heard the one about Freddy Fungus and Angie Algae meeting at a bar? They took a lichen to each other. That's right. Lichens are a mutualism between algae and fungus, where the algae provides carbohydrates to the fungus, and the fungus provides nutrients to the algae. So in that sense, there are resources that are being exchanged between both of these organisms, which are both consumers. And two-way consumer resource mutualisms are not limited just to lichens. We can also think of similar dynamics in corals, in mycorrhizae, and nitrogen fixation in plants, and agricultural mutualisms, and in digestive symbioses that many organisms have. So they're widespread. In addition, we can also think of mutualisms, other mutualisms, as being one-way consumer resource mutualisms. And this occurs when one species gains a resource, and in return for that resource, they provide dispersal. For instance, pollinators are dispersing pollen, and protection is another service that the one species can provide in return for a resource. And these one-way consumer resource mutualisms. Protection, for instance, against natural enemies. And so if we think about these mutualistic interactions and integrating them into food webs, does consideration of both antagonistic and mutualistic interactions alter our understanding of trophic cascades that have traditionally been shown in food webs? So there are people who have studied this in the past, and for instance, there are plant-animal mutualisms, where predation on mutualists of plants, such as pollinators, can reduce plant fitness. So here, predators are having a negative effect on plants, whereas in the traditional sense of a trophic cascade, predators were having a positive effect on plants. Then we can also think of animal-animal mutualisms, so mutualisms between two animals, and mutualists that attract predators can intensify predation and benefit plants. So let's say we have an herbivore that attracts predators, and that herbivore then indirectly increases predation on other herbivores that may be more harmful to plants. That could benefit plants. And when considering these different types of cascades that include mutualistic and antagonistic interactions, paths of antagonistic effects have traditionally been considered stronger by previous study. And when we consider indirect effects in ecological networks, whether it be antagonistic, mutualistic, or some combination of them, we can think of an indirect effect as being a net indirect effect, which is the outcome of all component indirect interactions. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's say we have ants and their indirect effect on plants. And this is a system that has been fairly well studied, and it has been described by Stursky and Eubanks in a great review in 2007, and in which they're considering the net effect of ants on plants through multiple component indirect pathways. So ants can have a negative effect on herbivores, which then those herbivores have a negative effect on plants. Ants also have a positive mutualistic effect on honeydew producing insects that we'll talk more about in a little bit. And then those herbivores also have a negative effect on plants. And the net effect of ants on plants depends on the relative strength of these species interactions. Now, what do I mean by relative strength? Here we can define the total interaction strength, T, as being equal to the per capita effect, the effect of each individual, times the abundance of that organism. So the strength of these interactions is going to determine which pathway has the greatest effect on the overall net effect of ants impacting plants. And like I said a little bit ago, previous studies have generally considered the antagonistic pathway here to be stronger. So if we are considering ants and their effects on herbivores, it has generally been thought that ants have a strong negative effect on other herbivores and a relatively weaker effect on honeydew producing insects. Therefore, ants would have a net effect that is positive on plants because they are overall suppressing herbivory. However, there have been problems with experimental design in the way people have, previous studies have looked at these types of dynamics. For instance, many studies were looking at plants that had, all of them had honeydew producing insects, and they were manipulating ant presence and absence. And they really didn't get at both of these pathways. They really were only considering one of them. So there's a gap in our understanding as to how ants really indirectly affect plants in this type of system. So I endeavored to ask, in an antagonistic mutualistic ecological web, how do trophic cascades depend on the relative strength of antagonistic and mutualistic effects? Beyond that, I have also asked, how do trophic cascades depend on predators in the fourth trophic level, which we'll get to secondarily? And then thirdly, how trophic cascades depend on elevated nitrogen deposition. So let's start with this first question, which is directly arising from our discussion here. The relative strength of antagonistic and mutualistic effects here. Are the antagonistic effects really stronger? So let me welcome you to my study site in Almont, Colorado, the Almont Triangle. And here I'm in the foreground is my beautiful field site. And I'm looking up valley towards Mount Crested View. And then beyond this is RMBL up the East River Valley. And in this meadow, rabbit brush, Chrysothamnus viscidiflorus, also known as green rabbit brush or yellow rabbit brush, is a very common plant that is co-dominant with sagebrush. Very common. And so let's consider rabbit brush in a network of interactions. So I'm going to put rabbit brush at the bottom of this slide, and from here we're going to build a network of species interactions. And rabbit brush is our foundational species here. And feeding on rabbit brush are beetles. Here we have a little leaf beetle called Monoxia schizonica that, as a larvae, it chews the insides of the leaves and lives on the insides of the leaves. And then when it develops into an adult, it skeletonizes the leaves. So it chews windows into the leaves. So it's a pretty damaging herbivore. And so we can think of this species interaction as being positive for the beetle, which I'm showing here with this round part of this species interaction arrow here. And then the triangular end of this arrow is a negative effect. So with each of these pathways, I'm going to show the effect of both species on one another. Here, the plant is benefiting beetles, whereas the beetles are having a negative effect on the plant. All right, what else is in our ecological network here? Well, we have ants. And this is the western thatching ant, also known as Formica obscuripes, and it is commonly found across western North America. And it is a voracious predator that drags prey items back to its nest to feed to their young, which is being shown here. And so these ants are also predators of the beetles that I was just showing you. So the ants are benefiting from eating the beetles, whereas the beetles are being negatively affected by that ant. And when you consider the effect of ants on beetles here, we can see from this figure here, we have adult beetle cumulative abundance. So over multiple surveys, their cumulative abundance. In situations where there's no ants present and when there are ants present, and there were many more beetles found when ants were excluded from these plants. And this had a noticeable effect on the damage that those beetles incurred on those plants. So just like this effect here, when we consider the leaf damage caused by those beetles, the leaf damage was much greater on plants without ants as opposed to plants where ants were allowed to be on those plants. So overall, we can think of, via this pathway of effect, ants having a beneficial effect on plants by reducing that herbivory. However, that's not the end of this network. Like I said, we are considering a mutualistic antagonistic network, and there's another organism that I'd like to introduce now, which are tree hoppers, or Publilia modesta. Shown here, we have an adult tree hopper, and these are the tree hopper nymphs. And tree hoppers are phloem-feeding herbivores. So they pierce the plant with their mouth part and they suck up the phloem, and they consume that. And the tree hoppers and the ants engage in a mutualistic interaction, which is a one-way consumer resource interaction, a food for protection mutualism. And as you can see here in this photo, the ant's antennae is all a blur, and that's because what the ant is doing is the ant is crawling on the plant, and it comes across these tree hoppers, and then it's tasting its environment with its antennae, and it takes its antennae and it rubs it on the back of the tree hopper. That tells the tree hopper, oh, there's an ant here. I'm going to poop out a droplet of what is called honeydew. These bugs are honeydew producing insects, which also include aphids and scale insects and some leaf hoppers. And what these insects do is they are consuming phloem but there's so much sugar in that phloem that they, and so much water that they poop out a lot of it in a substance called honeydew. This honeydew is rich in sugars, and it is a primary source of carbohydrates for ants. So the ants are coming along, they're sucking up that honeydew, and then they take that back to their nest and they share it with other ants, and that fuels their foraging across the environment. And what do the tree hoppers get? Well, they get protection. They get protection from predators such as lady beetles. And what I'm showing you here is an ant, our western thatching ant, attacking a lady beetle that's eating not one of the tree hoppers, but a different honeydew producing species. This is an aphid on lupin, which also occurs at the same field site in Almont. And this lady beetle has the aphid in its mandibles. It's trying to eat it, but our ant here is coming to the rescue and is crawling on the back of this beetle. It is spraying it with formic acid, trying to drive it away or capture it to drag back to feed to its own young. So this is a pretty effective mutualistic interaction that we would expect if ants are benefiting these herbivores, that via this pathway of effect, the ants are having a negative impact on rabbit brush. So if ants here are having a positive effect on rabbit brush by suppressing these beetles, but then they're also having a negative effect on the rabbit brush by encouraging these tree hoppers, what is the net effect on plants? Is the antagonistic pathway really stronger? Well, let's find out. So I performed a set of experiments where I manipulated ants and tree hoppers on rabbit brush. And I collected data on the performance of the plants, their reproduction and growth, and on the abundances of insects and the damage that the beetles were inflicting on the plants. And I found that overall, the net effect of ants on plants was that they were detrimental. So here we have, in this graph, we have plant reproduction in milligrams of seed per initial flower bud. So per bud that arose on the plant when I was first starting to manipulate ant presence on these plants. That in the absence of ants, there was greater reproduction, greater milligrams of seed than in the presence of ants. So that is our net effect. So how did this occur? How do we know the indirect pathways by which ants impacted plant reproduction here? In order to find that out, I conducted what's called a structural equation modeling analysis, where I was looking at the effects of our ants, which is our independent variable here, on plant reproduction via a set of pathways. Now let's talk about these different pathways. In between ants and plants in our ecological web, we have tree hoppers. We also have the beetles, which here I'm going to signify by their chewing damage to plants. There's also the leaf miners, which include the beetle larvae and as well as some flies that occur on the plants. There's also larval lepidopterans, or caterpillars, that occur on these plants and could potentially impact plant reproduction. And then there are other phloem feeders as well. So some plants had some aphids, some had leaf hoppers, so other organisms that are feeding on phloem other than the tree hoppers. And so we can think of the effect of ants on each of these groups of herbivores and the effects of these herbivores on plants. So these are the main pathways through which ants could indirectly affect plants and result in that net effect. I also considered flower buds as an important covariate because this represents the potential reproduction that the plants could have early in the season. So I included flower buds in this analysis too, and the effects of flower buds on each of these herbivore groups and on plant reproduction directly. I also considered all interactions between herbivores that could potentially occur. And with this model, this is my initial hypothesis, where I'm focusing on the effects of ants on plant reproduction. And to focus on this net effect and dissecting that net effect into its component pathways, I then simplified my model using model selection, where all of these paths between flower buds and the herbivores, between herbivores, I used a model selection criteria in order to find a better fitting model that did not include paths that were not important for explaining the net effect of ants on plant reproduction. Okay, so this is the model that I came to after the model selection procedure. And here is the results of our model. So remember that we're concentrating on the effects of ants on herbivores and the effects of herbivores on plants. And before I get into describing these pathways, I just want to explain a little bit more about structural equation modeling. When we are interpreting SEMs, we can think of the strength of a species interaction here as being relatively weak or strong. So SEMs are a way of looking at the interaction strength in a network. And when we think of a relatively weak effect, we have a predictor variable here and a response variable here. And we can think of a weak effect as having a shallow slope with lots of variation in the points around that slope. Whereas a relatively strong effect in a structural equation model analysis is going to have a steeper slope and little variation in the points around that slope. So this would be a strong interaction. And we can think of, in our diagrams, our weak interactions are going to be shown as relatively skinnier than our big, thick, strong interactions here. So considering the width of these pathways is important when thinking about the relative strength of these interactions. Okay, so one second, excuse me. So let's consider our interactions between the ants and our herbivores here. Ants have a strong positive effect on tree hoppers, and positive effects are shown here as red with these balls at the end. Then we have negative effects are going to be shown in blue with a triangle at the end. And so ants are having a strong positive effect on tree hoppers. Ants also have a negative effect on beetles, but that's on beetle chewing here, but that's a relatively weaker effect than our mutualistic effect here. And of all the effects of herbivores on plants, only tree hoppers have a significant negative effect on plant reproduction. And for every tree hopper we found on plants, there was negative 1.45 milligrams of seed produced there. So what we are showing here is that ants are indirectly negatively affecting plant reproduction via this pathway from ants to tree hoppers and tree hoppers to plants. And this may be a skinny little pathway here, so signifying a weak effect, But what our structural equation modeling is doing is it's calculating the per capita effect, so per individual. And by having a weak effect, these individually, however, these tree hoppers, there are many of them on a plant. And for instance, in this experiment, I had about 30 tree hoppers per plant to start. And so by having many tree hoppers on a plant, remember that our total interaction strength is equal to the per capita effect times the abundance of those organisms. And so what we are showing here is the per capita effect. If we multiply that by our number of tree hoppers here, that then results in a larger reduction in plant reproduction. Okay, so our conclusions from this study. Our conclusion is that, first of all, our mutualism here between ants and tree hoppers is the dominant interaction. It is the strongest interaction in this network. The ants reduced plant performance due to strong effects through tree hoppers and weak effects through other herbivores. In addition, the abundance of ants was 10 times greater in the presence of tree hoppers. And tree hoppers were responsible for driving the net outcome of this interaction between ants and plants. So the mutualism dominates this antagonistic, mutualistic ecological network. Okay, so that's the first story. What about our second one here? Let's think about how do trophic cascades depend on predators in the fourth trophic level in this antagonistic mutualistic web. Now, predators in the fourth trophic level are thought to have an effect such as this. Predators in the fourth trophic level prey on intermediate predators, also called mesopredators. And this generates a cascade with qualitatively different outcomes than three trophic level cascades. So here, our top predators are having a strong negative effect on mesopredators, our intermediate predators, which then have a weak effect on herbivores. Thereby, herbivores, which are not being suppressed by these mesopredators, can have a large negative effect on plants. So how does this work? Consider the following scenario. Let's whisk ourselves away off to the Pacific Northwest, where we can think of kelp beds in marine systems. And these kelp beds are being eaten. Kelp, the foundational species of that ecosystem, is being eaten by sea urchins. And so in a two trophic level system, we have many sea urchins and relatively little kelp. However, when sea otters occur in a system, which sea otters have been expanding their populations across that area, they are very good at suppressing sea urchins. They eat tons of these sea urchins, and thereby they indirectly allow the kelp to thrive. So when there's three trophic levels here, the sea otters are indirectly benefiting the kelp, and that foundation species is thriving. However, there are other scenarios in which there's a fourth trophic level. And in some areas, for instance, in Alaska, there are these killer whales that are now eating sea otters. They have been switching their diet to rely more and more on sea otters. And so in certain places, the killer whales are suppressing sea otter populations, thereby allowing the sea urchins to thrive and eat all the kelp once more. Therefore, we get less kelp in those types of ecosystems. So here in our food web of antagonistic species interactions, we can think of a predator in a fourth trophic level as having a negative indirect effect on plants. So Have others considered mutualistic interactions in trophic cascades across 4 trophic levels? Well, they have in terms of plant-animal mutualisms. For instance, predation on mutualists of plants can reduce plant fitness. So here we can think of ant-plant mutualisms, and predation on ants that are protectors of plants by eating herbivores can thereby, those predators that are eating the ants reduce plant fitness. There's also predation on predators of mutualists can benefit plants. For instance, if we have a predator that is eating a pollinator, the predator of that predator can indirectly benefit plants. But what about animal-animal mutualisms across these 4 trophic level cascades? That hasn't really been considered. So we endeavored to study this. And what could be our predator in a 4th trophic level position in this study system? What do you think? Well, turns out to be black bears. Black bears in Colorado have a huge appetite for ants. In Rocky Mountain National Park, almost a third of their annual diet is just ants, which is a huge number of ants. And so what I'm showing you here is we have a black bear that was caught in an image, a trail camera that I put up in Almont at our study site. And what this bear is doing is it is reaching into an ant nest with its paw, with its left paw, and then it is pulling back that ant nest. So I'll go back and forth a couple times here. That bear is digging into the nest, and what's happening is these nests have a large above ground component called made of thatch, which is what the ants get their name for, the thatching ants. And so, so thatch is bits of little twigs and grasses and mouse poop and that sort of thing that they all pile up. And then in the middle of that nest is a chamber in which the ants are raising their young. And those young are full of protein, and the bears are able to rip into those nests to expose those young ants and then eat them. So bears eat ants, and because ants are detrimental for plants in this case, based on that previous study, I expected bear consumption of ants to indirectly benefit plants. So I went out and I quantified some black bear effects on ants and found that from 2009 to 2013, bears attacked between 20 and 86% of ant nests in the study meadow each year. So there was some large variability in the number of ant nests that were attacked in a given year. And severe attacks, I found, can lead to ant nest inactivity. For instance, there was an ant nest in this log, and the bear came along and ripped open the log to expose the chamber of young ants inside, and it's hard for the ants to then rebuild. Over here, we have a nest that was a perfect dome, and then a bear came along and it dug into the nest to expose that chamber full of young ants, and it gorged on the ants. And this nest was unable to recover. It became inactive and no longer had any reproduction. So I used this bear damage that I was observing in my research site as a natural experiment. And I asked, do bears influence plants near these ant nests that were either attacked by bears or not? So I manipulated ants and tree hoppers around ant nests that were either attacked or not attacked by black bears. And I found that overall, bears benefited plants. Here, the net effect of bears on plants, on our rabbit brush, is positive. And once again, we have seed production on our y-axis, and we have the situation without bear damage and the situation with bear damage in these box plots. By the way, I should point out what a box plot is for those of you who don't know. Box plots show, among other things, they show the median, which should be close to the mean value in a group of points. They give you your interquartile range, which includes 50% of the points in your data. And then these whiskers, which come out to either side, go out 1.5 times the interquartile range to include all the points within 1.5 times that interquartile range. Beyond that, we have points that are outlying beyond those whiskers, are shown as individual points. And so these are a great way of summarizing data in a way that we can see the variability in those data. And so when we are considering these two boxes, we can see that two box plots, or box and whiskers plots, we can see that the median value here is below that of this. And overall, bear damage is causing there to be greater reproduction here. And it's not only reproduction, but the plants are also increasing in their above ground mass more so when they are next to ant nests that were damaged by bears versus those that were not damaged. So this is representative of the growth of the plant. So how did bears indirectly affect plants here? So in order to understand that better, I conducted a structural equation model analysis where I ran two models looking at the situation where bears had not attacked the nearby ant nest versus where bears had attacked the nearby ant nest. So this is called a multi-group SEM analysis. And similar to before, we're going to consider ants and tree hoppers, because here I had tree hoppers manipulated in this experiment. And the effects of ants on these herbivores, tree hoppers and other herbivores, and the effects of those herbivores on plants. I also included flower buds, just like before, to account for that covariate in this model. And I also considered the interactions between herbivores. So this is my initial hypothesis in this situation. And I then simplified the model using a model selection criteria in order to find the best model structure. So I eliminated some of these non-essential paths that were not important for understanding the effects of ants on herbivores and plants. And then I applied this best model structure to the situation where the nearby ant nest had been attacked by bears versus not being attacked by bears. So let's consider the undisturbed ant nest first. In this case, we would expect this to be similar to what we had seen previously in the last study. And so here we're seeing that ants are having a strong mutualistic interaction with tree hoppers. This is a very strong interaction here, symbolized by the width of this arrow. Ants also negatively affect beetle damage, just like we'd seen before. But ants also had positive effects on leaf hoppers, which are a type of phloem feeding insect here that does not have a mutualistic, it doesn't have a direct mutualism with ants, but this is a situation in which the leaf hoppers are benefiting from the ants, but the leaf hoppers are not necessarily having any effect on the ants. And this is also the case with these larval lepidopterans here, or caterpillars. Of all these herbivores, it's the leaf hoppers that are having a negative effect on plant reproduction. So the net effect in this situation of ants on plants is driven by the ants' positive effect on leafhoppers and the leafhoppers' negative effect on plant reproduction. So these ants, by protecting the tree hoppers, are actually also providing protection to other herbivores on plants, including these leafhoppers and larval lepidopterans that are also interacting with the plant reproduction. And in this case, it's the leafhoppers that are driving this negative effect on plant reproduction. This is the situation when the nearby ant nest was damaged by bears. We can see that the interaction pathways are much different. Here we still have a strong positive mutualism between ants and tree hoppers, but the effect of ants on beetle damage is no longer negative. In fact, it's swung to be positive here, unexpectedly. And ants are having no effect on leafhoppers, nor are they having an effect on larval lepidopterans here. So in this case, when bears are damaging plants, the ants, there's no complete indirect pathway between ants and plant reproduction in this model. So bears, by suppressing ants, are causing this indirect effect of ants on plants to break down. But what is the mechanism here? How is it that ants are influencing the herbivores and the rabbit brush? So ants can benefit tree hoppers by suppressing arthropod predators, like we had discussed before. Ants can also benefit the tree hoppers by removing their honeydew waste. For instance, in this photo here, we have a tree hopper nymph, young tree hopper, that has been pooped on by a tree hopper that is above it on the plant. So this is a droplet of honeydew that the ants did not collect. This is from a plant in which I excluded ants from being able to access that plant. And so these tree hoppers could benefit from the sanitation that arises from ants getting rid of that poop. However, the effect of bears on plants is very similar to that of arthropod predators. So over here we have the same graph that you'd seen before. I also took a look at plants that on which I observed predators that were not ants versus those plants that did not have those predators, and found that the plants that produced greater seed production had these predators present. And a previous study found that ants benefit tree hoppers by deterring arthropod predators. So I thought, well, maybe this is the main way through which the ants are benefiting the tree hoppers and potentially other herbivores. So let's think about these arthropod predators. Ants and other arthropod predators can be thought of as being in the same guild, the same trophic level, and there being intra-guild predation between them. Here, ants are, we have two ants attacking a lady beetle here. They will sometimes take that predator and drag it back to their nest to feed it to their own young, such as these ants dragging a spider back to their nest. Other times they can just deter the predator and drive it off and away from those herbivores. And in the absence of those ants, those herbivores can access the tree hoppers and feed on them. Here we have a lady beetle eating a young tree hopper here, which is shown in orange. They are orange before they turn black. So I thought this may be how this web is being driven, or this cascade is being driven. So in order to understand this better, I tested the effects of arthropod predators to plants by manipulating ants on plants, ant tending, and by also manipulating the arthropod predators on the plants. And then I measured herbivore abundances and rabbit brush. And so in this study, I used a multi-group structural equation model analysis to understand the effects of arthropod predators. Instead of ants, I'm thinking of arthropod predators and their indirect effect on plants, concentrating on these gray pathways here. And here we're thinking of arthropod predators and their effects on the caterpillars or larval lepidopterans, the effects of arthropod predators on leafhoppers, and the effects of the arthropod predators on tree hoppers and those herbivores' effects on plant reproduction. I also included flower buds as a covariate, just like before. And so let's consider this network of interactions in the context of no ants present on plants. So here, when ants are not present, we have arthropod predators are relatively strongly suppressing tree hoppers here. And none of these herbivores are having a negative effect on plant reproduction. However, when ants were present on plants, arthropod predators no longer had that negative effect on tree hoppers. And they didn't have a negative effect on other herbivores either. Excuse me. And unlike before, the tree hoppers here are having a relatively strong negative effect on plant reproduction. So when ants are present, they are suppressing arthropod predators' effects on herbivores, specifically the tree hoppers here, and allowing those tree hoppers to then have a negative effect on plants. And as you may have noticed in this case, which was conducted in a separate year, the interactions here are being driven by tree hopper effects on plants rather than the leaf hopper effects on plants. So our conclusions from this study are that mutualisms alter the outcomes of cascades across 4 trophic levels here, whereas other studies in food webs purely containing antagonistic species interactions, we would expect the 4th trophic level to negatively affect plants, but here we're finding it to positively affect plants. And this occurs by suppressing ant protection for herbivores from other arthropod predators here. We also saw that the relative importance of herbivore effects vary from year to year, where in one year the the effects of predators on plants was being driven by leafhopper effects on plants, and in another year it was treehopper effects on plants. And overall, we should consider these dynamics in the management of bears. Okay, so that's the second story. How about this third one? You're going to ask, what's elevated nitrogen deposition got to do with this? How can that be relevant in how in terms of the dynamics occurring here? So let's consider nitrogen deposition for a second here. Humans have dramatically altered the nitrogen cycle across Earth. Here we are showing year on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have terrestrial nitrogen fixation. We have the range of estimates of natural fixation occurring in the world, and then here we have a line showing total anthropogenic nitrogen fixation. So this is human-caused nitrogen fixation, which now rivals that of the natural nitrogen fixation occurring across the world. And humans fix nitrogen by creating fertilizers, by combusting fossil fuels, by growing legume crops. And these contributions have greatly altered the nitrogen cycle around the world. As we've done so, the part of that cycle is the nitrogen that is circulating through the atmosphere. And atmospheric nitrogen deposition is increasing. So this is the amount of nitrogen that is coming down from the sky into terrestrial and aquatic environments. And so we can think of atmospheric nitrogen deposition as occurring as people drive your cars. So combustion of fossil fuels puts nitrite into the atmosphere. Livestock, by pooping out so much manure and pooping and urinating, that manure then decomposes and puts ammonia in the atmosphere. And those two sources of nitrogen then drop down out of the atmosphere as dry deposition. They can also be converted to nitrate and ammonium, which also come down as dry deposition. Or these could also be incorporated into water droplets and come down in what is called wet nitrogen deposition. And if we consider how the Earth looked in, here's a model projection for 1860, where the warmer the colors we see here, the higher the amount of atmospheric nitrogen deposition, shown in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. We can see that historically, the Earth has had very low atmospheric nitrogen deposition. However, by the year 2000, atmospheric nitrogen deposition had increased dramatically across much of the world, including many terrestrial systems and aquatic systems as well, the oceans. So we have dramatically increased atmospheric nitrogen deposition. And this is a fertilizer. Nitrogen deposition often increases plant quality, and we can think of that as often influencing herbivores by improving quality for herbivores, leading to increased herbivory. However, much less is known about how predators are being affected and how predator effects on herbivores are being are then affecting plants in a world enriched by nitrogen deposition. And even less is known. There have been a few studies that have assessed predator effects on plants in terms of nitrogen deposition, but really nothing is known for very low level nitrogen deposition. A whole lot of the studies that have occurred have concentrated on very high levels of nitrogen deposition that occurred immediately downwind of agricultural operations or of cities where there's high amounts of traffic. Much of the world, however, is being blanketed by an elevated but low level amount of nitrogen deposition, the effects of which are relatively unknown. So I endeavored to think about the effects of nitrogen deposition in the context of the cascade of effects from black bears to plants that we had just talked about. And a previous study found that high-level nitrogen deposition, this is very high-level nitrogen additions, cause greater ant benefits for another plant species. So a species of sagebrush, where ants were engaged in a mutualistic interaction with tree hoppers, the same species here, and ants also had a negative effect on a different species of beetle, and overall the impact of high-level nitrogen deposition in that system was that ants were driving greater reduction of beetles and thereby benefiting the plants, those sagebrush. But this other pathway of effect really wasn't considered in terms of the net effect of ants on plants there. But because these interactions intensified, I expected for this system, for our system, that there to be greater effects of bears on plants as the species interactions became stronger under nitrogen enrichment. And our study system in Almont, Colorado is a good study system in which to do this because we have very low ambient nitrogen at RMBL and in the valley. And so in this graph here, here we are going from blue to warmer colors as we go from low to high nitrogen deposition. And you can see that there's this pocket of blue in Colorado that includes RMBL and Ullmann, where I conducted this study. So very low ambient nitrogen deposition, which means that I could add nitrogen and then be able to infer something about how other organisms around the region that are experiencing elevated nitrogen deposition could potentially be impacted. So how did I do this? Well, I created, first off, I created patches of the experimental site in which I manipulated nitrogen. And I did this within 36 ant nest enclosures so that I could think about how the nitrogen addition would impact the entire patch of meadow and the insects and ant nests within those. So I had 36 ant nest enclosures. And to give you an idea of the scale of this experiment, you can think of the length of a football field as being 100 yards. How many yards of, or how many football fields worth of this landscape edging? So I installed this landscape edging, which is a slippery plastic material that the ants could not cross beyond this landscape edging. There's a single ant nest in each of these enclosures. So the ants stayed within here and did their thing with all those mutualistic insects and also interacting with other insects and predators. So how much of this landscape edging was required? How many football fields? I have to bring this up because I did this work while I was at Florida State University, where football is king. So what do you think? Turns out to be 17 football fields worth of landscape edging that I dug into this Rocky Mountain meadow. So this was a substantial experiment that allowed for the manipulation of nitrogen in entire patches of meadow that were relevant to the foraging area of these ants. Okay. And within each of these enclosures, I applied experimental treatments of nitrogen deposition for 3 growing seasons, a very low amount of nitrogen, 0.5 gram per meter per square meter per year, which is equivalent to 5 kilograms per hectare per year. And I also observed bears causing nests to go inactive during this time as bears attacked nests within these enclosures and caused inactivity in a number of them. And then I also applied plant level experimental treatments in the 3rd year, where I manipulated the presence of tree hoppers and ants on individual plants within these enclosures so that I could understand how each trophic level was affecting the next. And I then measured rabbit brush and arthropod responses to these treatments. So overall, what did I find? Well, I found that nitrogen enrichment, this very low level of nitrogen enrichment, weakened the effects of bears on plants. So let's first consider the left-hand side of this graph. And here we have milligrams of seed per initial flower bud, that measure of plant reproduction that we've been talking about before. And here we can see in these box plots that when there's ambient nitrogen, so low-level nitrogen that's not been manipulated, when bears caused the ant nest to become inactive, the plants had much greater reproduction than in enclosures where the ant nest was active. So bears, by causing ant nest inactivity, allowed the plants to have greater reproduction here. However, when nitrogen was added, there was no difference between the seed production in plants in enclosures that had active or inactive ant nests. So something's being altered about this cascade. In order to understand this better, I conducted another multi-group structural equation model analysis where here we're looking at the effects of ants on herbivores, where beetles, tree hoppers, and leaf hoppers were the most abundant herbivores in this year, and the effects of those herbivores on seed production. Then I also included flower buds as a covariate as before. And when there was ambient nitrogen, let's focus on the pathways under ambient nitrogen here. Let's first consider the effects of ants on herbivores and herbivores on plants. So when we think about this, we see that the strongest interaction here is the benefit that ants have for tree hoppers. Ants were also negatively affecting beetles, but of these herbivore groups, it's the tree hoppers that were drawing down seed production in the plants. So under ambient nitrogen deposition, we could see the interactions just as we had previously seen them, where ants, the net effect of ants on seed production is negative here, is being driven by this positive effect on tree hoppers and the negative effect of tree hoppers on plants. So bears here are benefiting plants by suppressing ants and this pathway of effects. Also, these herbivores were strongly interacting with flower buds here, signifying potentially that the interactions between plants and the tree hoppers and beetles and leaf hoppers were stronger here. So this is our ambient nitrogen situation. What about when nitrogen was added to the system? When low-level nitrogen was added, we see that ants here are having a positive effect on tree hoppers like we had seen before, and this actually is a slightly stronger effect than we'd seen before. Ants still have a negative effect on beetles. Ants also benefit leaf hoppers, but none of these herbivore groups had a negative effect on seed production here. And flower buds here, the interactions, the pathways between flower buds in each of our herbivore groups, only the one between beetles and flower buds is still significant here. There was no interaction, no effect of flower buds on tree hoppers or on leaf hoppers. So overall, the cascade here is dampening because something's changing between herbivores and plants. The interactions between herbivores and plants are now weak in this situation. So, what can we conclude here? We can conclude that current widespread rates of nitrogen deposition can alter trophic cascades and resource versus consumer control of ecosystems. So, our low-level addition of nitrogen, which mimicked the amount of nitrogen that's falling out of the sky across vast areas of the western United States, even that very low level within 3 years, so relatively short term here, impacted this cascade and dampened the consumer control of plants in this system over insects and plants in this system. When nitrogen was added, ants were more beneficial for herbivores, but plant-herbivore interactions were weak, and this ultimately dampened the cascade. I've now manipulated nitrogen for actually 10 years, not 9 years, but I am continuing to manipulate nitrogen in this experiment to understand the effects of chronic long-term nitrogen deposition in this system. Okay, so in review, I asked several different questions about how trophic cascades depend on the relative strength of antagonistic and mutualistic effects on predators in the 4th trophic level, on elevated nitrogen deposition in the context of an antagonistic mutualistic ecological web. And here are the citations for the papers that arose from these studies, if you would like to look them up and learn more. But the overall conclusions, if you remember nothing else from today, are that it's important to consider both positive and negative interactions between species. The division between food webs and mutualistic webs is artificial, and we should really, in order to understand how dynamics actually occur in the real world, we need to understand how these ecological networks are composed of both these types of species interactions. And different types of interactions can be united via a consumer resource perspective of ecological webs, because mutualisms and mutualistic interactions in general can be considered from this perspective, as well as the predation and competition. Lastly, multiple types of interactions must be considered to predict and manage the effects of predators and nitrogen pollution. So there's a lot of interest in understanding how nitrogen pollution is affecting ecological webs and ecological functioning, and being able to manage that. Similar for predators such as bears and other large predators, and we need to understand how these multiple types of species interactions influence our management of animals and of nitrogen pollution. And with that, I have many thanks to give out to folks at Florida State University, especially Nora Underwood and Brian Inouye, and as well as Anna Grinath and Elise Cornish, and many folks at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, especially Ian Billick and Jenny Reithel, who first brought me out to RMBL in 2004 as a research assistant, and the many other folks who helped me out during my field studies over the years. And I'd also like to thank RMBL for the fellowships that they've provided to help me keep this research going, and the Environmental Protection Agency for fellowship support. And with that, I will take any questions you may have. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you before too long, hopefully. All right. Bye-bye.